And we are recording now. All right, so welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us at School16. Yes, I am multitasking. I'm letting a few other people in here right now, but it's really good to see you. We run these seminars every week to every other week, and this is our 25th seminar, and School16 is designed to help folks understand how to land opportunities in tech, and specifically non-technical opportunities. Now, product management, as we'll get into it, can be a hybrid role. Some PM roles are super technical. Usually they'll say technical product manager in the title, but some of them are not. Actually, I have a background in product management, and I took computer science in college because I was a nerd, but I've had very little computer science experience. So you don't necessarily have to be technical. And primarily the focus of the types of speakers that we bring into School16 are people that are in non-technical or non-coding roles in tech. And today we're really excited to host Maggie Crowley, who's Director of Product at Drift. To give you a quick overview of what the agenda looks like today, we're going to start off with a quick introduction from us. We'll be done in a couple minutes. I promise. We want to hear from Maggie, but then we'll jump into our conversation with Maggie. This is Q&A format conversation. So if you haven't been here before, it's essentially like a podcast interview where me and Sergey are the interviewers, and Maggie is our guest of honor. And by the way, folks, though, we will say that we want to make sure that we address your questions as they come up. So the easiest way to do that is to drop them into the chat. And something that we're going to do today as well is we will leave some time towards the end. If you want to unmute yourself to get yourself heard a little bit too, and ask your questions verbally, you can do that as well. But if you'd rather do it through the chat, you can actually submit those questions throughout the whole chat as we're going along here, and we will surface them as we continue the conversation with Maggie. I will say that the questions that are likely to be relevant to the most people in the group, we prioritize. So if there's a bunch of questions that we can get to them, we apologize, but maybe we weren't able to get to them because it was a little bit too specific for the time we have at hand, but we can always, of course, connect later and answer them as well. I don't think that will be an issue. So we'll do a Q&A conversation with Maggie, and then again, we'll have that open Q&A at the end as well.
Yeah, I'll actually add that Vadim and I decided to do something new today because we have a nice intimate group where folks, toward the end, we're going to let folks unmute themselves and ask questions directly. So we will be monitoring a chat throughout while we're doing our Q&A, and then in the end, you can unmute yourself as well. So hopefully we get to meet some of you here. I do also want to mention before we jump into our conversation that we have an early application deadline tomorrow for our Tech Career Acceleration Program. If you're interested in careers in tech and you want to learn directly from people in these roles across product, operations, marketing, and sales, maybe you're trying to figure out where you fit in, or you want to get a little bit more depth into those different areas. Actually, the way that I met Maggie is through her colleague, Sean Lane, who's going to be teaching an operations session for us at School16. And we have several classmates here or students that are in that program and I'm actually really thankful for Sean for joining, but also introducing us to Maggie, who's doing this seminar. But the program is for anybody interested in jobs in tech that wants to learn from these experts. Early application deadline tomorrow is just school16.co/program. Application takes about 3 minutes. And if you want to ask us about it, if you're not ready to apply, I'm actually going to drop my direct email here. And feel free to reach out, and I'd love to hear from you. Happy to talk and answer any questions as it relates to your career and interests in tech. And we also do info sessions regularly if you'd like to jump on a call with us. From there, I'll give it to Vadim to kick off our conversation with Maggie.
Awesome. So I'll stop the screen share now so that we can see Maggie clearly on the video. So Maggie, thank you so much for joining us. You know, part of the reason why we have these conversations is because there is no one way to get into many disciplines in tech, partly because they're constantly evolving, partly because the needs of every organization are very different. And I'm sure you experienced that as well yourself, not only in product management, but in the other tech companies that you were part of. But we'll just start off this conversation the way that we do with everybody else. If you could just kind of give us a little bit of a synopsis and an overview of your career, just to give context to the folks, because I know that in college, a little spoiler alert, I mean, it was in the description, but in college you were an Olympian, and that took up, I'm sure, most of your life outside of your education beyond that. But from there, eventually you did get into tech. So if you can just walk us through your story to start.
Sure. Sure. And sorry about my mid Zoom room change, just having some classic COVID internet issues. So yeah, I think where my career started was, like you mentioned, I was an athlete. I really had no idea that I didn't think at all about jobs. And I was just like, that's all I was going to do. Luckily, my parents made me finish college. Thank you to them. And then I graduated and I just sort of had no idea, like, what are jobs, like what do we do, what are the options, and so I went into consulting. I got a job at a human HR, basically HR consulting firm, doing as an analyst, just because I didn't really know what was out there. And I found consulting to be really interesting because you got to look at lots of different problems and figure out how to solve them. But what was missing for me was the follow through. So you didn't get to do anything about the solution, and you were just kind of stuck like, okay, well, here's an idea. Hopefully the client will go and build it. And I worked with some people who had gone to business school, and I thought, I had some idea that I wanted to make a change. So I went to business school, and my goal there was really to try just to understand what the jobs were like in tech and whether there would be a place for someone like me. My undergrad degree is in economics with a minor in literature. So I didn't have any sort of like hard quote unquote skills. And I interned at Google, but I was on an ad sales team. I still wasn't in product, but that's where I discovered that this was even a role that existed. I just had never heard of product management. But my roommate at the time was a product manager. And from there, I just sort of begged my way into TripAdvisor. I did a product management rotation program where I got to try out a couple of different types of roles. And that's where I discovered that it's the type of job that lets you do lots of different things. You can be a generalist, and you can be successful as a generalist. And you also get that. I think one of the coolest parts is when you ship something and you see your customers using that thing and being successful with that thing, and you get to be a part of that is pretty cool. And that's really what hooked me on the job and what keeps me excited about it.
Interesting. A couple of overlaps between the two of us. So, I mean, we're not Olympians at all, but we did study economics as well early on. And also I had didn't really know what product management was early, and got exposure to it through different roles. I actually also came from advertising. I did sales engineering there for an ad tech company, but I definitely understand that space too. But one thing we kind of touched on earlier is that the level of how technical you need to be successful in product really varies significantly. How technical would you say you are right now? And then I guess if you would compare it to when you were at Google as an intern going through that rotational experience, how technical were you then, and what changed since then, if anything?
Yeah. It depends on your definition of technical. I would say if your definition is coding, 0 then and 0 now. So I don't think you need to know how to code at all. I actually think it's a bit of a distraction from the core job of a product manager. And I've seen product managers, and again, very biased view because that's not my background, but I've seen product managers get really distracted by trying to help with like the technical architecture of a solution, when really our job is to understand the problem and the customer. So that was my take on that. But I will say that in my first PM role at TripAdvisor, one of the first things I did was learn SQL, and just really as a way to get much better at understanding data. And I think the better you can understand how to ask questions of data, which questions to ask, and give yourself a way to answer them on your own, that can go a really, really long way to making yourself valuable to a team, not being a burden on your engineering team, and just being able to bring something to the table as an individual contributor.
And for those people that don't know, in terms of understanding SQL, for example, to collect data, not being a burden to the engineering team, I'm assuming that's because so that you don't go to them for every little data request, right?
Right. And it's also just being able to say, part of, especially when you're a product manager, you're typically joining a team, there's already a product, and you have to figure out what to do. And some of that is trying to understand, like, well, what's happening with the product today? So what questions do I need to ask that will help me understand what's going well, what's not going well? And just being able to do that sort of discovery and look at the data on your own, I've always found is really valuable. And again, like, I don't have a background in data science. Like, I think it's pretty simple if you can use Excel and write like a VLOOKUP, you can learn SQL. It might sound daunting, but it's definitely not that hard. And it's just a useful skill that I really helped me in the early days of my product career.
Yeah, so speaking of useful skills, I'm curious, Maggie, when you were starting out, and when you think about, what you know now as you kind of rolls through the ranks in the product function, when you think about if we have folks here on the call that are considering product as a job, what are some things that you think you were good at or someone should be good at when they're thinking about whether they should get into it or not versus another role in tech?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think that there's one set of skills or one answer that is going to be like perfect for every company. And so part of it is that different companies need different skills and different types of people in the role. But I think the commonalities that I've seen that are helpful to me have been communication. So being able to, like, regardless of what you're working on, if you can communicate why it matters, how you got there, why it's going to be important for the business, and if you can tell that story to different types of people, you're going to be more successful. So storytelling is a part of that, but like, again, asking and answering good questions, understanding how to talk to users, all that kind of communication stuff is really critical to the role. So I think that's one thing, or one bucket of things. And another, I would say, just being curious is something. Like, the best product managers that I've seen and worked with are people who are just really curious about why things are happening and why users are doing a certain thing and who the users are, and they want to know more, and they bias towards being curious versus biasing towards trying to have the right answer. And I think if you want to be right all the time and you want to have the right answer, it's not a good fit for you, because a lot of the PM job is just not knowing and trying to answer and running experiments. So I'd say that's another mindset that's been really valuable.
That's interesting. So, you mentioned communication obviously is a really important skill. And I'm curious, because obviously you majored in economics. There is no product management major, although maybe some schools have it now. Who knows how good it is. But where or at what point in your career, or maybe it was even grad school, at what point do you think, up until you became a product manager, even, just throughout that time, do you think you really refined that skill, got good at asking the right questions, got good at communicating effectively, got good at understanding the problem of the customer, for example, which you said it is a core tenet of somebody that's successful as a PM? Or was it natural?
I don't think it necessarily was natural. I'm just trying to think about when the inflection points were. I think, honestly, for me, a lot of it came from having good coaches and mentors. I think a lot of the product job is learned on the job. And so a lot of it was watching and learning from the people around me, trying to find different resources online for who's doing it well, and then just sort of trial and error. I think it's just something that, like, the more I worked on it, the better I was getting at it. And I had a couple of role models who were really good at, like, good designers. So I think another thing that I benefited from was I met a couple of people earlier on who were really good at design thinking. And I took an elective when I was in business school on human-centered design, based on some of the practices of firms like IDEO. And that really helped me reframe a lot of the way I thought as a consultant, and put it more in the sense of, okay, well, how do I understand a user? Like, how do you do good user research? Like, what are the sort of biases that we have when we look at different products? And that, I think that stuff also helped me figure out how to ask better questions.
That's interesting. So, you've been a PM now at a couple of different organizations, and obviously you've done well at Drift because you rose up the ranks there. What would you say are something, aside from the fact that obviously the businesses are very different, what would you say are maybe a couple of differences between the role, let's say, that you had a TripAdvisor and when you were starting off as a PM, because now you're in a leadership role, which we'll talk about later. But
Sure.
What were some of the biggest differences in those roles at those two different companies?
Yeah, I think scale is a really big difference. So TripAdvisor, especially back when there was more travel happening, just the amount of for example, like daily active users, monthly active users was huge. So when you have a huge user base like that, you can do things like, we have this idea for a product. Why don't we just ship this and test it on a very small percentage of our traffic, see if it works, and then we can roll it out. So there's this mentality of testing and shipping and doing an experiment, which is awesome. But when it's so easy to do that, you just don't have to talk to your users, because you can just fall back on these tests. So I found that a lot of what I was doing was running small experiments and then like incrementally making improvements. It was also a more established company, and so it had a lot of product. And so when you join a really big company, the scope of your product role is much smaller. Then if you join a startup, you usually have like a much bigger scope in terms of how much of the product you're working on. So that was a difference. When I joined Drift, we were about 80 people. And so again, the scope of what I worked on was a lot larger, but Drift is B2B. So we have fewer users, and you can't do as much of that testing, because it's one thing to test a experience for millions of site visitors who are sort of coming and going pretty quickly. And another thing to A/B test a workflow that an enterprise company relies on. Like, that's not really cool to do, and those customers don't enjoy that or want that. So you have to do a lot more upfront research. You have to validate your ideas. You have to prototype them a lot more than I would say I was doing at that big B2C company.
That's interesting to me, because I want to tie that back to what you said earlier, which is really kind of the crux of some of the value that you bring in as a product manager. One, you need to fundamentally understand the problem of the customer, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's certain type of work that you do to accomplish that. But then you said also collecting data is really important. Now, for a company like TripAdvisor, I could totally get it. Tons of users, ton of data to collect. You're probably living in SQL.
Yes.
For your role at Drift, or when you're looking for, let's say, to bring on a product manager at Drift, how much importance do you place on those types of skills versus the other skill, which is knowing how to talk to an enterprise customer, knowing how to collect information to inform feature and product decisions?
I want to say that they're both important, but it sort of like depends on the seniority. I mean, the classic PM response to literally everything is it depends. But I would say, like, depending on the seniority of the role, if I was hiring someone who was entry level, like, I wouldn't expect them to have necessarily either of those things, but I would expect them to be able to talk through, like, what types of questions would they want to ask, and like how would they think that they might get that information. Whereas a more experienced PM, I would expect that they would understand the trade-offs between quantitative and qualitative data, when to use which one, like how to think about them both in context with each other, and just having a little bit more nuanced view of like what can you do. It depends on the scale of the company that you're looking at, but sometimes it might be enough to talk to 5 customers, and that might actually really validate your idea. Sometimes you might have to do a more sophisticated user research study. And sometimes you just maybe even have a core belief and you want to just ship something and you believe in it, and that's also fine. So I think it's just trying to understand like how you make decisions and how you de-risk things is what I look for when I'm talking to a new PM.
So that what you just said makes me curious about how these decisions are made and how these dynamics happen in a company, maybe even a company like Drift. If you can speak to it, because you have competing priorities and interests. You have leaders, founders, executives of a company that want to see something in the product. You have engineers who are, they're the ones that are actually building it, and then you have the PMs that are trying to manage all of these competing priorities and interests and actually listen to the customer in the end of the day. Mm-hmm. How does that work in a company, maybe a company like Drift? How are those decisions made, and how much of it do you own, let's say, as a director of product at Drift?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. And the one group that you left out that we really believe strongly in is design. So our teams are totally cross-functional, and it's the 3 functions are absolutely equal. So it's not like anyone is sort of running the show more than anybody else. But I would say the decisions get made in 2 directions. We have a strategy, a business strategy, which then becomes a product strategy. And then we also have sort of bottoms up, like, what are we seeing on the front lines? What are the teams hearing from customers? Like, what are the customer requests that we're getting? Where are we seeing escalations? Like, where are we seeing performance needs? So each team will understand sort of that bucket of work. And then my job is to say, okay, this is the business goal that we're going for the area that I work on. Here's what I think are the big themes we need to tackle to get there. And then the PMs and the tech leads and the designers will say, okay, given that information, here's what we think we should solve for. So it's really like a back and forth between the teams. And we try to talk to we have a somewhat unspoken rule that every product manager should be speaking to at least one customer every single week for at least an hour. So because of that, we're hopefully, we have enough data that we can make those decisions pretty quickly. And it's not super hard for us to have that conversation.
I think that's a great unspoken rule. I would say that for especially any startup, and if you're going to be a founder or a leader in the company of any department in the company, you should be talking to your customers all the time on a consistent basis so that you know what your true north is. I think that's really cool that you guys have that.
Yep.
I want to go back a little bit because you mentioned earlier on in the conversation how you really kind of begged TripAdvisor to give you the opportunity and experience those different roles and figure out what you're good at and what you like there. And, I actually was just on LinkedIn today and I saw someone that I know who went from a marketing role at a company to within the same company becoming a product manager. And you went from consulting to business school. Obviously, people saw that you're smart, you had some pedigree there, but also gave you a chance. So I'm kind of curious your thoughts around that, and perhaps maybe you have some stories of people that have transitioned into product, or maybe that you have taken a chance on, and how they were able to convince you, given their background, that they would be good at that job.
Yeah, I have a really distinct memory of someone on the team asking, I think it was actually pretty sure this was when I was interviewing for Google, and then this is before I had any experience in tech at all. And the hiring manager just asked me, he was like, well, I have several candidates who have backgrounds in this space who've done this thing before. Like, why should I hire you? And I was like, literally no one is going to work harder than me. I really want this job. This is my dream. Like, I just went in and just tried to be like, you don't understand how hard I'm going to work for you. So that worked for me on the first one. And then for TripAdvisor, I just researched the hell out of the interview. Like, I spent so much time way over preparing for any possible scenario, like practicing case studies. And I was just like, I might not have the background, but I'm going to nail this interview and I'm going to do everything I can to get this job. Because my boyfriend at the time, who's my now husband, is from Boston. Like, I wanted to stay here and this was my opportunity. So that's what I did. I would say, as far as people from different backgrounds, the most common path I've seen are people who shift within a company. It's really hard and I hate this, but it's really hard to just become a PM fresh at a company where you don't know anybody. But if you can get into a company and then demonstrate your skills and then move over, I've seen that path work several times. We also acquired a company a couple years ago, and one of the women on that team that we acquired, she became a product manager with me as her manager, and they were going to put her in more of a support role. And I actually saw her role more as product management. And so we made her product manager, and she's a theater major. And she is absolutely amazing. Probably one of the best PMs I've ever worked with. And what I look for are just people, again, who are curious, who are interested in the job, and who are open to kind of putting in a little extra on the side to catch up if they haven't already done the role.
Okay, so actually I want to talk about this theater major that is an incredible product manager. So did they have formal product management experience before that? If not, how did you all make up for that, and what makes her so good at it?
Yeah, let's see. She had no formal product management, anything. I'm just checking her resume to make sure she was actually a theater major, and she was. She had no formal product management training. She had never heard of the role before. It was a startup that we acquired, and she was the person who was doing all the stuff, customer service, it was an AI startup. So training, annotation, she was the glue that was holding the team together. And so when I looked at what she had been doing, I was like, you're doing all the functions of what a product manager would do if you had one. So I could see it in the work that she had been doing. And I would say what makes her successful is she cares at the start. It's just that she cared so deeply about the customer experience that she was trying to create, that she was just willing to try to figure it out. And then what we did to get her up to speed, she did I think she took a course sort of nights and weekends to catch up on some of the specific skills of running customer research, a little bit more on data analysis, because that was really unfamiliar for her, and a couple of other things. And then we just spent a lot of time, I just spent a lot of time with her coaching and going through processes and helping her out, because I knew that she was going to be really great at it.
Mm. Yeah, that goes back to what you said earlier, which is finding a good coach
Yeah.
and mentor, because it's going to be probably pretty subjective to every role. So I want to talk a little bit about, and then I also want to get to like PM leadership and what that even means.
Sure.
But I want to talk a little bit about your experience with interviewing for these different roles, because it sounds like you, in your own words, over prepared for the interview at TripAdvisor, and then probably by the time you got to Drift, maybe you, because you had already been a PM for a while, right? You felt a little bit more prepared. But what was that experience like at TripAdvisor specifically? Because you were hired in as a product manager right away, right?
Yep.
Okay, so if you could talk about that experience a little bit, and then maybe how it differed from the experience at Drift, because I know Drift is a little bit more of a unique company. Maybe.
Yeah. So I think the TripAdvisor interview was pretty typical for MBA or post grad school or even post undergrad product management interviews at big tech companies. They followed generally similar structure at the time. I don't know if they've changed, but I would imagine they're similar, which is like some behavioral interviews, just kind of about like you and how you make decisions and your experience, and then some case interviews. So things like, I think it was that Amazon did one on like a market sizing, or like how do you design I think I interviewed at Amazon. I didn't get the job. How do you design a Kindle for someone with vision impairment? So there's questions like that they have you do. And there's like a couple rounds of that type of thing. So when I got to TripAdvisor, the interview was similar, some behavioral stuff, and then an in-person sort of exercise. And then they also had me do a take-home exercise. And that's really where my over-preparation took off. I don't think take-home exercises are really super appropriate for people mid-career, just because like you have work and lives and it's sort of obnoxious. But at the time I was in school, so it was probably fine. And I just like spent double, maybe even triple the time I was supposed to spend just like trying to make this thing amazing. So that was my experience there. And then I would say at Drift, at the time, again, at relatively small startup. So for that interview, it was much more behavioral and really about how I made decisions, what my experience was, what I had shipped, what I had learned from what I had shipped in the past. We didn't do really an exercise if I remember correctly. And it was more about what skills can I add to the team, and do my values align with their values, and can I help them shape the product org?
Gotcha. Now I'm curious, because TripAdvisor was your first PM role, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, obviously you had HBS and your internship and stuff on your resume, which I'm sure helped you get those opportunities, like the interviews at Amazon and the like. Anything else that you had on your resume that you think stood out specifically, maybe that you even tailored for like product management roles, since you didn't have a specific like direct PM experience?
Not really. I mean, I did a independent project my second year of grad school where I like built a website and like talked about, that was I tried to find something where I was like, I can build something and show that I'm like a creative product manager. But I don't think I did a really great job on that front. I think like you mentioned, there are some shiny spots on my resume with the Olympics and with HBS that make it a little bit easier for me to get my foot in the door. And so my strategy was like, I'm going to get my foot in the door, and then I'm just going to be like aggressively over prepared and just pray that someone hires me. So I don't know how helpful that is, but that was my literal strategy.
That's really helpful. I think people need to hear that more often, though, is like whatever you can use to your advantage to get your foot in the door, that's your priority in the beginning, right? First you got to get the interview, you got to get the face-to-face, and then you can worry about making sure that you prove your worth.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think if I were to go back, I would have spent more time networking. I just didn't realize how I sort of believed that like, okay, I have a good resume and I've checked all the boxes. Like I'm going to be a good fit. But now that I'm more in the space, I understand like the role that networking can play, and like how far someone introing you can go. And I think I probably would have had to do less aggressive preparation if I had realized that I could network my way to a job, or at least network my way to an interview.
That's fair. And of course, we'll never know exactly which components of that, played that much weight. But, even the,
Sure.
the web project that you worked on, I would say, like for me, for example, I had worked on a startup that ended up failing, but that is how I got product management interviews. And I interviewed at
Right.
places like Trello, Stack Overflow, you know, Seamless and stuff without direct PM experience. So that type of stuff can go a long way as well, these personal projects.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
So, you know, now you've been at Drift and you are a director of product management. So can you talk a little bit about what do you think it takes to actually be promoted in product management and actually become a product leader in an organization?
Yeah, it's funny. I was talking to someone about this morning. It's a totally different job. It's really interesting. Like being an individual contributor, product manager, like your job is to understand the customer and like help shepherd features and products out the door. But when you become a manager of PMs or a manager of managers, like your job is much more about people and systems and making sure that the people in the systems are right for those teams to make good choices about those products. So I think for me, what helped me get promoted was I think probably one of the bigger things I did was I stepped in and I said, I'm going to set up a process for us to do goals and planning, because like we're growing and we're not coordinated, and our product is going to start to become like really siloed. So we need a more coordinated way for us to start shipping together, and just demonstrating that I was sort of like stepping up and taking on that like people and process type of work. So that was one bucket of stuff that I was doing that was different. And I think the other thing is this big sort of glamorous sounding bucket of strategy. A lot of PMs want to do product strategy, and the reality of product strategy is just a lot of research and de-risking bets. And so I did a lot of work on like how to think about product strategy, how I viewed the product I was working on in the market, where I thought the market was going, and how I thought we should respond to those inputs. And so I think being able to show that you can think about not just your product in the context of the users who use it, but your product in the context of your business, and your business in the context of the market, like that growth and perspective is one of the signals that I think you can look at to see that someone is ready to take on more responsibility. And that is assuming that like you're shipping your stuff on time and it works, which is a sort of surprisingly difficult baseline for getting promoted.
Interesting. Okay. Well then, you know, given that you're in a leadership role now, I guess in terms of like your responsibilities and your day-to-day and the like, did you like being a straight up product manager, individual contributor, even though that's actually a little bit of a misnomer because you're not really an individual contributor as a PM,
Yeah,
touching everything, but did you like that a little bit more?
I would say I'm way better at this role. A lot of the detailed management and the follow through of being a PM, I was not super great at, and I had to like brute force it. I would say this type of work is more natural for me personally, but that's not to say it's better. I hate the narrative that like the only way to improve is you have to become like a PM manager. I love the idea of like a principal product manager who's really good at the thing that they're working on. So I wouldn't say I'm not making like a value judgment about which one's better. This is a better fit for me.
Well, it's good that you can be self-reflective like that. So I guess when you say follow through and some of those responsibilities or activities as a PM that maybe you had that were more challenging for you, can you give us some specific examples of what that means?
Yeah, I think really good product managers not only are shipping things that are really solving high value problems, but they're getting all the details right. So it's not just that you've figured out the problem and you've guided the team or helped the team get to a solution, but it's like you've enabled your sales team, you're following up with the launch details, you're like making sure all the announcement stuff is done. Like there's all this other stuff you have to do to make your product successful. And I definitely am a person that's like, that part didn't come as naturally to me. And so I had to like really force myself to pay attention to all the little stuff.
Yeah. So actually speaking of that, I'm curious, you know, you talked a little bit about some of the skills or some of the things you have to do, but can you maybe give us a little bit more color as to the day-to-day, and you can talk about Drift or TripAdvisor, the day-to-day of somebody in that product management role and how they might organize their day, given that you have so many different stakeholders and competing priorities.
Yeah, I think it can be a real challenge just to figure out like what to do at any given time. I would say the PMs, at least the PMs that I'm working with now, have a general sense of, you know, or the way we try to structure our weeks are like, what are the things that we have to get done this week? Like, what is the most important thing we should be working on? And let's keep that top of mind, and let's block our calendars to make sure that we're actually going to do those things. And then it's sort of like, okay, that's my big chunk of work. And that could be customer interviews. It's going to change based on the stage of your product lifecycle that you're in. So I have a PM I'm working with right now. She's on the discovery, sort of like divergent discovery phase of a new idea. So she's doing a lot of research. She's doing a lot of customer interviews and working with design. And I have another PM who's working on something that has shipped. And so she's spending a lot more time with customer success. She's looking at escalations. She's looking at performance and spending a lot more time with the engineering team to see like, how is it going and what can we do to improve? So sort of like the balance of your time will shift based on where your product is. And then there's like, you know, weekly meetings and other sort of syncs and presentations that you have to make here and there, which I think would probably fill up the rest of the time.
Got it. Pawan asked the question, how was the transition from B2C to B2B company, context of being a PM? Like, was it a bit of a shock in terms of the responsibilities? Was it really different?
You know, people are people. And the people that you're building for in B2C are the same people that go to work and you're building for them there. So at some level, it's exactly the same. What is different is the how you launch products, how you do research, and the type of data that are available to you. So like I mentioned before, a lot of times in B2B, you will have fewer users. And so you might not be able to do the same types of like A/B tests that you could do in B2C. But you generally also have closer relationships to those customers because they pay you. So like, it's way easier for me to go and talk to one of my customers because they pay us and they have a customer success manager and I know where they are and I know their email. But in B2C, that might not be the case. And it might be a little more challenging to actually do good user research. So I find that B2B is really nice in that way because I get to talk to my customers all the time. And it's pretty easy to do that. So I really like working in B2B, but it's just different.
I have one more question. And by the way, folks, we're going to open up the floor to, if you have any questions, in a couple of minutes, you'll be able to unmute yourself and ask that question. All I'll ask so that we know who to call on. In case your video is disabled, just use the raise hand feature on Zoom, which you should be able to find pretty easily. My next question is kind of a weird one. So you seem like a jack of all trades. I say that because a lot of what you say like resonates with me, and that's who I am as a person too. I think typically product managers are like that as well. But if you were not going to go into product management, but you still wanted to go into tech, let's say, let's have it be at least a little bit more focused in that way. And then maybe we can broaden the question as well. Like if you were to do anything else, but if you were going to do something else in tech other than product management, what would that be if you never got that opportunity to be as a PM at TripAdvisor?
That's a really interesting question. I'm going to say sales ops, or like an ops role, like a sales or marketing or customer success ops. I think those teams or product ops even. I just really enjoy all the people that I met that are in, like Sean, who you guys know is like so fun and cool and smart. But I think those roles are really interesting because they're the people who are connecting all the dots within a company, and they sort of understand how companies work and like how all the tools fit together and how all the teams fit together, and they know what's going on to see all the data. So I think that's probably something that I would be interested in. Yeah. I don't think I could do one of the front lines roles like sales or customer success. I just don't have that in me, but.
Well, and let's say customer success. Sales I can kind of get because you have a quota you're responsible for. Oftentimes there's a lot of pressure that comes from that alone, the revenue targets you have to hit. But what about customer success? Why not that? Because you're in a customer facing role anyways.
Yeah, honestly, it's because the role to me looks really hard. I have so much respect for people who do that job because it's just like you're constantly trying to help customers be successful with whatever the product is. And like, just like PMs are dealing with many different inputs from, customer feedback or founders or sales or marketing or whoever has ideas. And we're trying to balance that. Like at the end of the day, especially at a startup, your product isn't perfect. There's going to be issues, and the customer success team are the people who are the front lines experiencing that with your end customers. So it's a hard job. And they're on the phone all day. They're always have to be nice. It's just huge respect for them.
True. I can totally get that as well. And you would say then, let's say for pressure that you have, like, for example, a product launch not going well or something, you don't feel that same sense of pressure, or it's different pressure and you don't mind it?
Yeah, I think it's different. I love the like high pressure startup situation. I love the like take a big swing, go for it, ship something big, make a bet. I think that's really fun to do. So I don't really mind that. But I think for me, what I look for is the ability to have agency over the problems that I'm working on. And I think in products, you have a lot of agency to influence what you're working on, influence what your business is doing, and influence obviously the product itself. And so I think that's why I don't mind the pressure, because it's, I can do something about it. I think in another role, it would be a little bit harder if I didn't feel like I had as much agency.
Yeah, that sounds really entrepreneurial of you, by the way. People that want to have that level of ownership and then don't mind the potential negative repercussions that come from that. It is actually pretty different than, let's say, getting yelled by a customer.
Yeah, which has happened, which will happen. It's fine. You'll live through it.
You mentioned, Maggie, a little earlier that there's kind of a big difference between being a product manager at a small startup versus a larger and a more established company. Can you talk a little bit about the differences in the roles there?
Yeah, I would say one of the biggest differences is that in a bigger, more established company, you have the products are more complex and more nuanced because they've been around longer. So, I would imagine at like a Facebook, a PM might own like a very small section of a page, whereas at a startup, you might own the whole page and plus 2 other pages. So, the sum total of the product is probably is definitely smaller to startup. There's fewer people, so you have more ownership over the whole thing. But I don't think one is better than the other. It's just a different type of development and different type of thinking. And I think the cool part about working in a startup is that you get to have influence over such a large section of the product. But I would also say the trade-offs are really hard. And it's really hard to ship really, really high quality software when you're trying to ship all sorts of things all at once. So like you just have to make trade-offs like that. And for me, I just liked being able to have more of an influence than I felt like I did at a big company as a PM.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I would agree with that as well. So I do have one more final question, but before I ask that, folks, if you have a question and you couldn't figure out the raise hand feature or something, we will stop talking for a second and you can unmute yourself and ask your question. If nobody has any question, that's fine as well, but you can have the floor.
It looks like Palesa actually has one. So Palesa, feel free to unmute yourself and go ahead.
Hello. Hi, Maggie. I have 2 questions actually. The first one is, can you please share with us a time where you experienced failure and what steps you did to overcome? Yep. And then the third question is, in your job, there's a lot of things you are learning, experiencing. Are there any resources that, you can share with us to help us, learn more at the same time? Thank you.
Yeah, great questions. Fail constantly. I would say there's a couple of there's big failures and small failures. I would say, like I mentioned before, I interviewed at lots of places coming out of grad school and got very few jobs. I really only got the 1 job because as I said, I was like quadruple preparing for those interviews. I am very bad at case interviews and I'm doing fine in my career. So like, it's okay if you're bad at them. I, for whatever reason, just can't do them. So I have survived. So that was like bucket of failure. And I would say I also can share like a product management failure. I was working on a product last year and I had been at Drift for 2 years at the time. And I was like, I got this. I know exactly what we're doing. The tech lead, he had been at Drift forever. We both knew what we were doing, quote unquote. And we just skipped over a bunch of steps in our process and, didn't get it right. Didn't get the customer problem right. overbuilt the solution. It didn't work. And we had to basically scrap it and go back to zero because we just skipped over all the stuff that we knew. And I would say like when things like that happen, especially at work, my process is like acknowledge and take responsibility for the failure, because it was definitely my fault. I could have done something differently. I didn't. And so it's always like, hey, boss, this is going badly. I messed up here, here, and here. That totally sucks. Okay, here's what I'm going to do about it. And here's how I'm going to not do this again. So I think that's failure is inevitable. And so just getting out ahead of it, being honest about it, taking ownership has always served me well, because like it's going to happen. And so what's more important is how you react and how you respond, and then how you really try to make sure you don't make the same mistake again. And then I would say, as far as resources, let's see, there's a couple of, it's always hard to do this off the top of my head. There's a couple of books that I found are really helpful. Melissa Perry wrote one called The Build Trap that I really like. There's also, you know what, I find that subject matter books are a little bit better. So there's like product management books. So Melissa wrote this one. There's a product leadership one that I think is called Product Leadership. Marty Kagan has written a couple ones. Also his blog, which I think is like this, but the blog, has lots of good articles on many, many different topics and products, which are super excellent. And then I would say there's books or podcasts or articles in the different areas that you have to be good at as a PM, like Measure What Matters is another good one if you're thinking about goals and metrics. The Design of Everyday Things is a great basic book for design. There's probably like 100 I'm missing, but yeah. I don't know. You guys probably know some other books we can drop in the chat as we're thinking here.
If anyone else has other ideas, for sure, but this is obviously an awesome start, and I'm throwing them in the chat as well. So that's wonderful. Thank you. Okay, and I think Nicole, I saw you had your hand up as well. You can just unmute yourself.
Hey, so my question was actually about failure, but I do have another question, which is I've been doing some research about product management, and I was surprised to see that there aren't a lot of women in product management. Is this true in what you've seen so far, Maggie? And if so, what can women do to like kind of get into the role more often?
That is a really good question. Sorry, I was finding a link. This is a link from our class that's public. This has everything. Okay, so let me answer your question, Nicole. Yeah, I think there are often days when I'm the only woman in the room, which sucks. But I think that like the way that I think about it is I try really hard every time I'm in a room like that to A, talk about it, but then B, especially when we're hiring for roles, like there have to be women on the interview panel, and we have to interview women, and we have to interview other underrepresented communities or types of people for roles always. So I think it like you, as a hiring manager, like that has to be part of how I operate and how we operate. And then I think the other thing is making room to coach. It's not just a hiring problem, but it's also like how do we retain women in these roles? And so a lot of that is like, we need role models. So I'm trying to stay in this role to like make sure I can bring more women with me. Actually, my whole team of PMs right now is women, which is super cool. But it's also like making sure that we mentor, we manage them well, that we provide opportunity, and that there's people looking out for them when they're not in the room. So I feel really strongly that that's part of my job as a product leader, is to like make sure that when we're thinking about who's getting promoted, that we're not thinking about things in a biased way, that we're being really objective. And that we just have more women at the table, so less of that happens. It's kind of like that's a hard answer, because it's like you almost need someone to like open the door. But I think the other thing that's been really helpful to me is having a group of people outside of Drift who are my like PM community, and finding people, other women or men, or whoever, whatever gender, doesn't matter, who are like at my level, who I can talk to and who I can have a community with, who can help me understand like am I experiencing bias? Like, am I being held back? Like, how, like, is my reality the right reality? And I've found that group of people who are my like go-tos for when I'm having like a question about product or a question about my career or whatever, like that team has helped me progress faster because they give you really good advice because they're in a similar position, just at a totally different company. So that's another tool that I found to be really helpful to like help me personally progress.
That's awesome. Thanks for highlighting.
Yeah. Hopefully I answered your question. It's a hard one, other than like, I'm trying my best.
No, you definitely did.
Okay.
And I'm someone who's like trying to get into product.
Yeah.
So that makes me feel better. If I get
Yeah.
there, then we'll see. Progress is being made.
Yes. Yes. There are some amazing women. There's a women in product organization. There's lots of people out there. A lot of us are super active on Twitter. If you're looking for more sort of role models.
That's awesome. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
The next question we have is from Rajiv. You can go ahead.
Hi, Maggie. Thanks. So my question is related to digital products, you know, like box products where, you know, there's manufacturing and shipping and all those were like the traditional products. As you look at digital products, the roadmap kind of changes, and it's so multi-influenced. And so I was just wondering about just some ideas on how to manage that kind of a roadmap. I'm doing one right now, and I'm constantly getting pulled and bombarded because of the different influences of the digital landscape. So,
yeah, it's a good question. I find that when there are too many stakeholders, too many competing priorities, too many requests, for lack of a better word, happening, my method is to anchor the roadmap or the plan in the goal. So if I'm really, really crystal clear about what are we doing, why are we doing it, and what is the goal we're trying to hit, then it's much easier when a new thing pops up to be like, great idea. Like, this is how that would fit into the story. Or, you know what, actually, like, this doesn't help me get to that goal. This helps me get to a different goal. So if we believe that this first goal is one we care about, then like, yeah, we're not going to be able to do that. And I think it's the saying no and the not having enough people to build all the things is the worst. That's the most frustrating part about being a PM. But I think everyone understands trade-offs and everyone understands that we have priorities. And so I think I also try to spend a little time being empathetic about why a person is asking for something, because it might be really painful for them, right? Like they might be experiencing, if it's a salesperson, maybe they lost a big deal. So it's like, spend a little time trying to dig through and understand, okay, why is this person making that request? Like, let me peel back the layer a little bit. Let me get a little more information from them. And then you might be able to at least build some empathy so that person is more willing to accept the no that you're about to give them, because you better understand the problem that they have.
thanks.
Awesome. Thank you, folks. Those are actually really good questions. I appreciate the insightful questions that everybody asked. I will drop another resource into the chat, which is the podcast.
Oh, right. The
that
podcast.
Maggie is a host of. How often do you guys do those episodes?
Every other week.
Nice. Do you like being a podcast host?
I do. Yeah. I forgot that I do that. Yeah, that's actually, this is a good point. I wanted to bring this up. I think one of the best things that, outside of building a peer group of people that are somewhat on my level at different companies, to help me grow, the podcast has been probably the best thing I've done for my career. Not because it's like people listen to it, but because it forces me to think through what I'm learning and to write it down and make it like accessible. And that process of writing down, reflecting, and saying back or teaching helps me learn better and has helped me like grow faster than I think I would have done before. So I would suggest like find ways to write and to reflect on what you're learning, even if it's internal, right? Like even if it's just sharing a lesson with your fellow coworkers or sharing a lesson, with your network. It doesn't have to be like you need to start a Medium blog about products, but writing or reflecting has been one of the best things that I've done, and I would definitely suggest doing that.
I think those are great parting words. And actually, Sergey and I have been doing a podcast for a couple of years as well, and that absolutely, it's a forcing function. like even for example, how do you communicate for somebody to understand the unit economics of a business, right? You can forget the details or startup financials, right? Yeah, you can forget for the details if you're not a CFO, if you're not working that type of stuff day to day. But if you're forced to teach somebody, you have to reflect on it and write it down and communicate it to somebody in a way that actually has some takeaways, then it's a great way to learn.
Yeah, agree.
Cool, folks. So I'm going to drop one more time a link to our survey. So if you want access to this recording, please do follow that link. We'll also follow up with an email for you if you forget about it and would like to provide your feedback. We would really appreciate it. Also, we'll drop one more time a link to our program application page. If you want to hear from experts like Maggie around product sales, operations, and marketing in a formalized curriculum that actually helps prepare you for those roles, do check out that application. The early deadline is tomorrow. Maggie, thank you so much for joining us. This was super insightful for me. I loved hearing about your experience because a lot of it really does resonate with, I think, how I am. And it's always, I think, great. Part of the reason why we bring in people like you is, you know, everybody's very different. Everybody's story is very different. And there's no one way to get into a particular career path. And I bet if I look on your LinkedIn 10 years from now, you're going to be doing something totally different, but we'll see.
Terrifying. That's terrifying.
You never know.
We worked so hard to get here. But yeah.
It'll be,
thanks for having me.
It'll be even cooler, I'm sure.
Thank you so much, Maggie. It was awesome to hear from you, and I appreciate your candid answers to everybody's questions.
Yeah, I hope it was helpful. Thanks, everyone. I appreciate it.
Awesome.
Super
Thanks
helpful.
everybody for
All right,
joining.
everybody.
Bye.
That's it. Have a good one. Have a good rest of your night. Bye-bye.